All right. Hello, folks. Well, good morning for me. It depends on where you are at, whether it's still morning or not. Probably not the morning for everybody but Chad, just given the distribution of the population across the world. Glad to hear that everyone is doing well. Luke says he's doing quite lovely. Looks like we have a couple people here. And we have Julio. Okay, so we got a full crowd. This is going to be a shorter one, but still a fun one. So I will hop into it. Before I do, if you got any topics or anything that you want to talk about offhand, just post them in the chat as always. That way we can be sure that we get into it and that we get a chance to discuss. But in the meantime, let me pull up the slideshows. Oh man, I messed up the title. This one is Matching and Subclassification. Ignore this title here. Chapter 5, Matching and Subclassification. Promise I have that on the other slides. I'll turn my webcam back on. Okay. So, light agenda today. Just going to talk about the chapter overview, which if anyone has any thoughts, again, post them in the chat. I know things are a little bit delayed, so if you post them now, we'll be able to talk about them. And then I'll talk about something I think that you might be excited about. I'm quite excited about, so I'll leave it as a little surprise here at the end. So I want to jump straight into the chapter overview. I'll have my this slide should not update. It's on my other computer. Okay. Well, we'll talk about the crux of this chapter that we have to remind ourselves about confounding. And then we'll talk about some of the math behind it, a math overview. And then the other part of the chapter that I actually think was the most important part of the chapter, to be quite honest. The part that you probably read over and thought was a fun story. But it actually came back later in the chapter. And it's not a point that the author writes about sort of as an explicit point, but I actually think it's the most important point out of the whole chapter that sort of sneaks right in, right underneath. So I'm going to give a disclaimer on this chapter. I am happy to be running this live stream and I happen to have this slide deck, but for anyone that's watching, especially in the future, I think the folks in this book club know from my interactions on Discourse, is that I'm not an expert in causal inference. I'm just somebody that has read this chapter and I'm doing this book club. So don't take this live stream as fact. I would highly encourage you to go read the source material and get familiar with that. But this is more of an active discussion. So all of us here learn in the moment and we all get used to the concepts of causal inference together. So not a professional causal inference expert at this time, though I am working towards it like everybody else here. Did not update this slide as well. Man, I should double check my copies, but matching and subclassification. So again, not the potential outcomes chapter, the matching and subclassification chapter. I think there definitely was, to jump straight into the chapter, there's one really, really important point of this whole chapter, and it's probably the most obvious point, but I'm going to bring it up right here at the beginning. We had this good prompt, which I always appreciate from this book. This prompt, and let me turn off my webcam so you can read the whole thing. But we had this very important prompt as we want to answer a question that's, pretty relevant. Do cigarettes cause people to die faster? I probably should have said at a higher rate. The reason I did not say at a higher rate is because everybody dies at the same rate, which is you're definitely going to die. A little bit tough of a topic to start out I'll turn my webcam on. A little bit tough of a topic to start a morning live stream with, but the important causal question here is: do cigarettes speed up people's death rates over cigars and pipes? So actually, I found this to be quite an interesting question, right? It wasn't do cigarettes cause people to die faster at a faster rate than people that do not smoke at all, but do people who smoke cigarettes die at a faster rate than cigars and pipes? I didn't pick this example. This is the example that came from the book. Wrong window. Okay. So this is this graph, I think, is the thing I want to highlight first. When most people would do this analysis, I'll turn my webcam on, but when most people do this analysis, let's say a junior data analyst, or even a lot of data scientists, to be quite honest, people that I've worked with who are really smart, the first thing we do is we would pull up a categorical outcome plot. In this case, I should say a bar plot. And I even did this one in Google Sheets to show you how sort of pervasive this is, right? Like anybody can do this. There's now the tools in Excel and Google Sheets to just grab the death rates and plot them. And when you look at it, it seems fairly clear, right? That people that smoke cigars and pipes die at a higher rate. And this is even if you look at different countries. So very much is that in every country, the rate of cigars and pipe smokers is greater than cigarettes smokers. And so when you think about it, we go to a company and we work on marketing campaigns, which people buy things more often. If you think about where there's greater occurrences of, let's say, car crashes, like there's so many things where we would do an initial just data pull and make this sort of, I don't want to necessarily say claim, because a lot of us in this book club won't make this claim, but I think it's very easy for people to stop at this chart and come up with a conclusion. That is what most people do. Because we're in a causal inference book club, we know, I think we're one step ahead. We know that it is a bad idea to do this, but I think without this sort of knowledge, this is what most people would do. And certainly something that I used to do earlier in my career. Looking at the live stream comments, Chad asks, do I have any alternate text? I will answer that in a moment. Would like to see what people think about trimming propensity scores. Luke, we will talk about propensity scores in a couple slides here. Lars is already bringing up the book of why there is a chapter about the lung cancer topic. Okay, thank you for mentioning that, Lars. I need to dust off my copy and read that chapter as well. I should probably be referencing that a little bit more. But I actually am going to bring up that later on as well, about Judea Pearl's work in a greater context. So coming back to the topic at hand, again, most folks would stop at this stage. They would use Google Sheets, or they'd use a SQL group by, or Tableau, or whatever data tool of choice, Pandas group by, it doesn't matter. And we would get to this chart and say, oh, yes, we do believe cigars and pipes cause more deaths at a higher rate than the other two treatments. Or I guess in this case, untreated, treated, and treated. The point Scott clearly jumps into, and sort of the one that we were expecting, is that, well, hold on a second, there's this other thing, which is if you look at the ages, which we've also plotted here, the age distributions are completely, in this case, completely inverse. And he made this example up, but the point still holds, right? That cigarette smokers maybe are a younger, hipper crew, and cigar smokers are an older generation. And it also turns out that old people die at a higher rate, just kind of very correlated. The older you are, the more likely you are to die. And that violates this conditional independence assumption. So, not a surprise for anyone that read this chapter, but anyone that's in this book club, but certainly the underlying theme of this chapter, and something that I think we, even if we read this chapter, like, I'll be honest, I'll probably still make this mistake at work sometimes. It's very easy to pull up a group by chart and get here, and it's very tempting to then make claims. So we have to pull out our familiar tool, which is a DAG. And I'll reinforce here again that early on in the book, Scott makes this claim, or actually he makes this assertion, and I totally agree with it, that this DAG isn't something that comes from the data. It has to come from domain expertise and be justified. So you're not gonna get like a select star from Spark or whatever from an API. Like, this won't come from the code. This really has to come from us as humans writing this down and defending it. So very tempting to be here and just make this do this group by. I think this is what most people do. It feels like, great, I've done the data analysis, I haven't injected my own opinion. It's tempting to stop here for so many reasons. It's easier to code. It's easier to justify and defend. But a lot of times we have this sort of thing going on that people can fail to look at. In this case, it's pretty obvious, but I think in a lot of cases in the world, certainly when I worked at, let's say, companies like Sweetgreen, there were uneven distributions of consumption of health and wellness type topics from New York to Los Angeles to Houston, let's say, to Philadelphia. So there are changes in demographics that are sort of latent, but you can only connect them if you use this DAG, which again is totally human constructed. So ignoring the philosophy for a second, we'll get back to that in the upcoming section. Let's now actually talk about matching and subclassification. So the bulk of this chapter was dedicated to these mathematical tools. I'm just going to tell you right up front that we're not going to do a huge treatment on the tools here and the in-depth of the math and everything like that. I think the book already does such a fantastic job that I don't think I could add anything here, but I'll give you my rough notes and my take on them. So everyone agrees, especially because we're in this Causal Inference book club, that you have to control for things and you have to ensure that you're not letting sources of bias and confounding creep in. So the first topic we go through is subclassification. Basically, you split everyone into some sort of groups, do some fancy weighted averaging. I think the pros, super easy. This math is very simple, actually very explainable as well. I think even most non-statisticians would be able to follow this once you explain a little bit about how you're controlling for things. But as he brings up in the Titanic example, doesn't scale super well. So when you have just one or three groups and really one thing that you're controlling for, not too bad. When you start having groups that have a lot of categories in them, so the Titanic example brought up age, if you start splitting age by integer, it doesn't work out so well. And then once you start throwing in other things you're trying to control for, like whether the passenger was in first class or second class, or I think there's a third class, right? There are three categories. Suddenly you end up with a ton of buckets, and that's only just two. And then if you apply even another, let's say even a binary bucket, now you've multiplied everything by a factor of two, and now you're not able to find groups that have every single outcome in them, and doesn't really work out. So works in small groups, doesn't work in large groups. The next strategy that was brought up was exact matching. So pros, again, really easy. You look at your trainees, you look at your non-trainees, the table goes on a little bit longer here, and then you just match them exactly on the thing that you're trying to control. In this case, it was age. So if you have a lot of non-trainees, you can do this if you're controlling for age. Again, easy, can't always find a perfect match. As I'm talking through this, let me know what you folks think, whether you agree with what I'm posting here, or whether you had some more thoughts. Again, I think this is where most people were thinking we would spend most of the time on this live stream on. So I would love to hear your thoughts on these methods and what you think. So while you're thinking about that, we'll go to the next one. Approximate matching. So not always possible to find an exact match. I think this is largely true. Not everything is going to be one-to-one matched. So you use some method. In this case, I believe we use nearest neighbors method to match things up. More flexible, right? So now you don't need an exact match. Maybe you don't have a huge amount of untreated folks. Maybe you just have multiple things and you can't find a one-to-one exact match. So, sort of like the horseshoes and hand grenades thing, you get close. Downsides, though, is you had to do more math, right? There were, I think, a couple people posted on the discourse about this, in that you have to do math to find the match, and then you have to do math to account for the bias where things don't exactly match up exactly. So now it requires two more steps. and there was a question, we'll see this later as well. There was a short discussion we had about what are the ways you match and what are the ways you account for bias. And coming back a little bit to the point we had in the first section, when you do subclassification and exact matching, you don't have to justify too much. The math just works out. But once you come here, you have to pick a model, you have to do some regression. Things become a little bit more challenging to understand and explain, which for me is a challenge I have at work all the time. And then it also becomes a matter of opinion of what type of models you use to do these two things. So nothing seemed too controversial here at this point, but it's still something you have to pick and justify, I guess, when you're writing a paper, if you're in academia or in industry. What kind of models are you going to pick to do these things? And then we got to the section that seems like is the most interesting, probably the newest, and something that I hear about at work more and more now is about this thing called propensity scores. So you take a bunch of covariates, and I don't think Scott explicitly said this, but it sounds like you run some sort of logistic regression, and then you end up with a score for each untreated and treated units, and then you match things up. So the pros, it does seem to be like the cool new thing, but the cons were it requires even more math. And then the biggest point is not everyone it was written in the book that not everyone agrees that this fully controls for that the confounding that we were seeing, or that we're trying to eliminate. So I don't know if this is an actual con. I'm going to add a sub-bullet, but even in the stream, and you guys are posting in the chat, what people think about trimming propensity scores seems like an arbitrary way. I think this is where I'm challenged with propensity scores, to be quite honest. It's that it makes sense. Like, I get where things are going, and it seems to make things more flexible, but in the book, Scott writes about how not everybody is fully on board with it, even causal inference experts. On the discourse, there was a short chat about propensity scores, and the Stata ones were coming up with a different range than the R and Python ones. So I actually don't even know why that was the case. Why this propensity score graph that was here is different than the ones that I was getting in Python. Somebody else was getting in Python in Colab, and then what looked like the R examples. I don't have an answer, and this is I think this is maybe the primary challenge with propensity scores. Rahul posted a question, so I'll get to that in a second. So this is where I left off. So I think an important part of the chapter was that, sources of confounding can creep in and they can cause bias. There were these four methods actually about how to control for that. Subclassification, exact matching, approximate matching, and then I'll say propensity scores as the newest method of approximate matching. But I don't know how I would use propensity scores at work. I don't know I don't know whether I'm skilled enough in them to be able to justify the matter, and it sounds like these matters do need to be justified. So it's sort of an open question I have as a practical practitioner of causal inference methods if I were to use them. I don't know what you folks feel about them. I guess, post in the chat or whatever, or on Discourse if you feel like you would be able to go into your workplace or your paper or wherever you're using causal methods and justify propensity scores, but I don't quite feel like I'm there yet. Rahul says simple matching talks about average multiple control samples if they're matched to a single sample in the treatment. This removes variance from the control group. How does this affect variance in inference? Well, I don't have a specific answer for you. I haven't done the math, honestly. But it sounds like... Well, it sounds like a couple things, right? Obviously, there is some source of variance. So maybe somebody who's 18, this person makes $8,500 a year, $50 a year, and some other one makes makes 9,000 or 10,000 or something like that. So certainly I would make the argument that if you had more samples, you would get a better sense of what the actual thinking through this carefully, how I would word this. The thing we're trying to estimate is the average treatment effect, or the average effect for the treated unit. And I think, like any statistic, you're gonna have variation, right? You just have to hope that the samples you have are representative of the thing that you're trying to estimate. And if you had more data, then you could be able to estimate the variation. So actually, that's my official answer, is that with the single data points, you're not going to be able to estimate the variation. That happens in any statistics, not just causal inference. I do wonder in practice whether, outside of this toy example, whether when people make claims about average treatment effects or things like that, they need to include variation as part of their claim. That certainly happened in the HIV example that we had a couple chapters ago, where the magnitude of the effect was not just enough. There was a larger group of folks, and then both the paper author and Scott were saying that some of these effects don't really seem to matter once you include the effective variations. So I think in this chapter, this is for illustrative purposes, and I wonder if in real life you would have much more data. So when you do this sort of exact matching, you also would have you also would include the amount of variation to see whether it washes out the effect, the whatever average treatment effect that you have. That's my off-the-cuff answer. I hope that answered it. I would look for variation if I was to do this in work for real. I wouldn't just take a single point estimate. Luke says, it's strange that he never mentions logistic regression. I spent ages thinking, wow, that sounds like logistic regression, and then realized that's basically what it is. Yeah, that's where I got stuck too, Luke. I'll be frank with you. I was looking at it, and I'm like, I feel like this is logistic regression. Like, you're taking a bunch of covariates, and you're assigning a probability that it will end up in one category or another, which is, to me, the definition of logistic regression. I also assumed that if it really was logistic regression, and econ uses regression so strongly, that they would state that it's logistic regression. I think I need to do more reading, like Chad talked about. Where are there alternate texts that cover this? Because I kind of am stuck on propensity scores. The idea makes sense. What we're trying to do makes sense. But again, as printed in the book, sounds like folks have a lot of different opinions about this. So it's a new field that is still forming. As you say, maybe it's an econ thing. Maybe the people that do logistic regression and the people that do econ haven't been to enough conferences together where you like chatted about it to suddenly click these two ideas. But I have that same sort of that same mindset as you, that this just sounds like logistic regression. All right. That will close out my discussion of this chapter, I think, as it was intended to be read, which is, you have to control for confounding, and these are the methods that you control for confounding. So I want to talk about the last portion that I took away from this chapter, which wasn't necessarily explicitly written as the idea, but I'm just going to dive into it. I'm curious what you folks think about my take on things. So it really had to do with two pieces of the chapter. The first one is, there was a good page about that didn't have anything to do with math, but it had to do with Ronald Fisher and these statistics experts and the idea of smoking. And so there was a good couple paragraphs written about how Ronald Fisher and a couple other statisticians, when these debates were going on about smoking and the incidence of lung cancer, is how they brought up tons of valid proof about how there are all these confounders of genetics and things like that couldn't be controlled for, that meant you couldn't make the causal claim that smoking caused lung cancer. And I picked this image of Ronald Fisher smoking. Let me flash it again right here real quick. Because it seems like the guy likes smoking. I'm not a smoker myself. I think I have now been sufficiently convinced that smoking causes lung cancer. Now, if I put my statistician hat on, I agree with Ronald Fischler, but it was so fascinating to me that maybe, one of these godfathers of statistics, somebody who clearly knows a lot about this topic, somebody who's even been brought up multiple times in this book, from the basic t-test to the last chapter, which was the I'm forgetting the words, but the whole the teacup thing, statistical inference with randomization. I have to go back and remember what that term was. That he has an opinion that was just wrong, and maybe he's both right, but about the math, but wrong about the thing that matters, which is, does smoking cause cancer? And this is largely what came back again later in the chapter, not about Ronald Fisher, but some of these methods and models aren't fully accepted yet, right? So we talked about propensity score. We talked about bias correctors. I apologize so much about all these typos, but we talked about bias corrections. So Rahul had brought that up in the discourse. I really wonder, in the practical sense of things, is we have all these methods, we have all this math, and then what does it take to actually make the causal claim in a way that people believe? So at the beginning of this live stream, I had that picture where people make causal claims and they're wrong, and they don't control for confounding. So they're wrong in thinking that cigars and smoking cause more death. But then on the opposite side, you've got people like Ronald Fisher who are right about the math, but then they're wrong about the thing that's happening, which is smoking causing cancer. So Ronald Fisher threw up all this noise about confounding and genetics, and there's no perfect control. Like, you can't perfectly control for this thing. Maybe the thing that causes smoking is some gene that expresses itself. So if you smoke, you happen to smoke because maybe you're a bigger risk taker, but that also correlates with cancer, and that's a backdoor criterion. Like, who knows? Because we'll never have, at least for now, we don't have perfect clones of ourselves to run controls over. So just really fascinating to me that you can be wrong by not controlling for confounding, and you can be wrong by trying to control for confounding. And these models, while they're good, are just another area where people can disagree about what's right or wrong. The reason I bring this all up is I still am stuck on how I would use a lot of this in reality, and one half of that being, like, I don't fully understand the math and the propensity score, which is an easy thing to fix. But then the second part being is that, like, if I go into work and it's not a bunch of econ majors, is this going to be something they can verify, and is this something that they will believe? And then even, like, conversely, if they are a bunch of econ majors, if I use a logistic regression and say that, is this something that they'll believe? So stepping outside of the book for a second, I'm just a little unclear on how I would use these things to calculate what I believe would be the correct backdoor criterion, how I would justify the directed acyclical graph, and then whether it would actually work out in a field, or at least where I work day to day. I don't know, and I wonder if you folks, maybe it's a much straighter shot for you. Maybe these methods and this math was, like, super simple, and you know exactly how you would use them in the field you're in, but I'm sort of still grappling with those questions. So as always, I like to come back to a quote. I think, actually, in this chapter, Scott did a really good job summarizing what we're doing. We're really trying to look for this independence assumption. The key word here being assumption. Something that we as humans have to decide that comes out of data. We're trying to figure out whether things are exchangeable. So this is what Rahul just brought up. Just above is the average. Is that the one that's exchangeable? Does that introduce any noise? Or if we don't average, would that make things better? And then we're essentially trying to find that balance, right? So we're trying to, in some way, balance our uneven distributions of cigar smokers and cigarette smokers into balanced distributions that we can then compare in some fashion. And that, again, is the crux of the chapter. So while I talk through the surprise that I'm going to get to in a quick point, I have been chatting now for, I think, a good 8 to 9 minutes, just off the cuff, and a lot of them were my own ramblings and ideas. So again, let me know what you folks think before I jump on to the next point. So what's next? Let's read another chapter. Let's take 3 weeks this time. The chapter looked a little bit longer, and to be quite honest, I'm actually really interested in regression discontinuity. I use regression very, very frequently, and particularly in time series. I have a lot of discontinuities. I don't think this chapter is going to go into time series discontinuity, but it certainly looked like there was discontinuity in treatment. So, I'm actually really thrilled for this chapter. Another cool thing, we are halfway through the book. So chapter 5, I'm not counting the conclusion, but and I guess I should count the introduction, but we're about halfway through. So I think that's a pretty good milestone. When I started, a couple months ago, I wasn't sure whether this would work out or not, but it seems like now that we're halfway, I'm fairly confident. I think folks like it, and I guess we're going to find out whether there's a regression or time series discontinuity in whether the first half was more useful than the second half. So a kind of a good inflection point. So thank you again for being here and learning with me. And with that, I will talk about what our surprise is. I don't have a slide on it, but I'm reaching out to folks who are experts in causal inference. So to come speak here. And actually, the first one I reached out to and who said yes was Scott Cunningham himself. So I am working out with Scott what the best format is for him to come in here. I need to figure out some of the details about, I don't know what he would want to talk about. So let me figure out what he wants. I need to figure out a way to get people on this live stream so we can chat. And then I need to figure out a way to include all of you as well. But one of the things I'll probably do right off the bat is I will post a thread on Discourse that's like, what questions do you have for Scott? I'm not going to promise that we'll go through all of them yet, but I'm really looking forward to having him come in and for us to engage with him, to hear his thoughts. Maybe about the book, maybe I'll get to interview him, but I think that would be cool. And then I am also going to reach out to have already reached out to other people who I view as, like causal inference, I shouldn't say mentors, but like role models. I think there are a couple folks in industry in particular, because I work in industry, that do these things in industry. And I'm really fascinated to hear what their take is as well. So I'm going to try and bring some guests on. I'll figure out what that means with the timing. Maybe we'll do chapter review and then guest, and then chapter review and guest. Maybe we'll space things out a little bit more. I'll figure that out, but definitely going to get Scott on. So really excited to have the person who really, he made this happen by writing the book. So really happy to have him on. So with that, we're at live Q&A. Let me look at what we have in the chat. All right, yeah, Luke, Chad, and Lars are really excited to have Scott on. Super cool. Did I speak to Sean Taylor in the end? I'm curious why you asked, Luke, because Sean Taylor is one of the people that I'm going to reach out to. I've chatted with him ad hoc a number of times, just about random stuff, one-on-one. He's quite a friendly and nice person. And then certainly he puts out really, really great talks. He's a very generous person with his knowledge. He shares about what he does quite frequently. So I'm hoping I can get Sean Taylor on. I will ping him. You spoke about him all live stream. I forget how much to talk about Sean Taylor. Clearly you could tell I think he does good stuff. So he is one of the people I will ask to see whether he will come on to a live stream, or at least in some way provide his input. So if I can't get people onto the live streams, I'm gonna start asking folks who I think are experts to just tell us what they think. Maybe give us a list of materials. As Chad had mentioned earlier, it's nice to get different sources and different references. So maybe these folks will know about some new method. Maybe there's some paper about propensity scores that just got published. So That way we get a balance of opinions, I should say. So we all learn causal inference in as many ways as possible. So Chad says, even when constructing DAGs, it's possible to construct them in several different ways that seem reasonable, but I think he meant contradict each other. Yeah, that's actually the issue that I'm having with DAGs as well. And Scott also brings that up in the book in a number of ways. He talks about how the Titanic DAG could have been written a couple of different ways. In the HIV example that was brought up in the last chapter, the regression was run 4 times with different DAGs. So this is a big question I have. One is how do you defend DAGs from a philosophical way? Do these folks who are experts, do they go in and do they challenge each other and then they settle on it? Is that the way they reach consensus? And then from a practical way, I wonder if you run your analyses like multiple times. Do you run it with one version of a DAG and see what happens, and then do you run it with another version of a DAG and then see what happens and then compare results? Again, that was hinted at in the last chapter with the HIV example, but I don't know how this works in practice. It's a really good question, Chad. It's actually the primary question I have about using a lot of these causal inference methods, and I'm going to word this in a particular way, and I'm going to be intentionally very vague about it because I don't know whether I can talk too much about it. But in the companies that I've worked at, there were sort of 2 parties about the DAGs. There was the people that were causal inference experts, and I would watch them discuss about how they would work on DAGs. But then the important part was that when it came to the business decision makers, they would have their own ideas of what the DAG should be, but they wouldn't want to work about it in the formalized way that's written down, like the way the econ folks seem to want to work about it. They would have their own way about talking about DAGs and their own semantics about it, and it was just fascinating watching their discussion. I don't know whether the discussion ended up being super productive in the sense that it led to a consensus, but it was that's the challenge that I'm having with these sort of causal inference methods when I think about them, is like not only do you have to be an expert in the math, the experts in math like Ronald Fisher disagree about them, and then if you then bring this to the people that are like the financial decision makers or the organizational leaders in a company, they have their own opinions. So I'm really curious how somebody sort of, if I use an American analogy, runs like this football from like the 30-yard line on the opposing side all the way through all these people that are challenging it to a touchdown where something the score has changed. I would have a tough time doing that because I'm not an expert on the math, so I would have a tough time defending my own math, and then I would have a tough time defending my DAG, and then I would have a tough time being able to convey that to stakeholders. So definitely an open question. Yeah, longer answer than I think a lot of you were bargaining for. Definitely let me know if me talking about my thoughts and my experiences helps in this book club. I'm sort of just doing it, but if you folks if somebody tells me that these sort of long ramblings are not very useful and they prefer me to stick to the text, happy to do that as well. With that, any other questions in this session today? Anything else that you want to talk about the math or whatever? Okay, Chad seems to like my thoughts on things. I'm glad you're finding value in them. Well, with that, I'm gonna do my typical countdown while I wait for the live stream to end. But open for any questions, and I'll say going once, going twice, going thrice. Julio seems to also think the real world experiences are insightful. I'm glad that's the I'm glad that my experience is able to help in this way. I guess I got to work in a number of cool companies, so interesting to see. For me, especially interested to see how the academics contrast from my experience in corporate life. With that, though, it doesn't seem like anybody else has any other questions. I'm looking at the chat. So there's always the discourse. Really appreciate you folks jumping on the discourse and and engaging. It adds, I think, a smooth flow to this book club. We get to chat async throughout the weeks and sort of primes topics, and it feeds into this live stream, and then we have interesting things to talk about. So I will open up the regression discontinuity topic just after this in the next 5 to 10 minutes, so you can post there. By now you know the drill. Let's read the chapter over the next 3 weeks this time, and see what we take away from it, see what we learn, what is reinforced in our mind, what seems to be new. And then I will also post a thread in the general discourse, the general topic about our upcoming engagement with Scott. So maybe we can start with questions, and I will work out a format with him as well, see what he wants to do. And I think it'll be a lot of fun. So enjoy your Sundays. Thank you again, and I will see you in 3 weeks, at least on the live stream. All right. Bye, folks.